While Caleb was jotting notes on a red-breasted nuthatch, a bright orange citation flapped beneath his windshield wiper, charging him for birdwatching. He blinked at the paper like it might dissolve under the soft Oregon sunlight. The spring air was still cool enough to bite, and the scent of pine sap lingered on his sleeves. He tucked the leather-bound notebook, edges worn smooth from years of field use, under one arm and stepped toward his old Subaru. The citation rustled in the breeze, clinging stubbornly to the glass. He peeled it off slowly, reading the bold print as if deciphering something in a foreign tongue. Notice of violation, unauthorized wildlife observation. Fine, $250. Below it, the HOA seal, a leafy badge with the words, Aspen Ridge Harmony Council, sat like a wax stamp of disdain. Caleb frowned. Birdwatching? The trees around him swayed with a quiet ease, unaware they'd become the setting for something regulated. He folded the notice and slipped it between the pages of his notebook, then drove home with the radio off, windows down, and his mind turning. Ben was on the porch, seated in the old rocker that had belonged to Caleb's grandfather. The cushion had long since lost its fluff, but it groaned in that familiar way whenever he shifted his weight. His mug steamed with black coffee, same as always. Caleb parked, hesitated, then climbed the steps. "Good morning," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Ben nodded, eyes narrowing a bit like he'd already sensed something off. "There's something I should show you," Caleb admitted. He handed over the citation without a word. Ben read it slowly, then again, lips pressing together. No flare of anger, just a deeper stillness in his face, like the surface of a pond suddenly gone silent. "They're fining you, for birdwatching," he finally said. Caleb nodded. "Apparently on HOA-controlled land." Ben gave a dry huff, not quite a laugh. "HOA doesn't own that trail." "Not according to this." For a long moment, nothing was said. Only the soft creak of the chair and a chickadee calling in the distance. Ben stood, slow but firm. "Let's get coffee." The hollow mug hadn't changed since the early '80s. Same cracked vinyl booths, same handwritten specials on a curling whiteboard behind the counter. A radio hummed with AM jazz, interrupted occasionally by a cheerful ad for chimney cleaning or auto tinting. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, and Walt Merritt looked up from the crossword at his usual booth by the window. He waved them over. "You two look like someone flattened your tires." Ben slid into the booth across from him, Caleb beside him. "They fined Caleb," Ben said. Walt squinted. "Parking?" "Birdwatching." Walt let out a snort and reached for his coffee. "Judith's been itching to rename that trail since last fall. Swore the name, Heron Loop, lacked branding value." Caleb looked between them. "Wait, rename the trail?" "Whole thing's been part of a HOA nature initiative. Mostly signage and fees." Walt shrugged. "New signs, new bylaws, same old grab." The waitress, a woman in her 60s with a name tag that said, "Marge, don't ask for soy milk," poured them coffee without being asked. She gave Caleb a wink. "You're the boy who used to draw owls in the margins of my menus." He smiled despite himself. "Still do," he said. "Only now I get fined for it." Ben sipped quietly, then turned to Walt. "You remember where the boundary runs out by Heron Loop?" "Sure do. Your dad marked it with rebar and a red flag when he surveyed in '73. That trail cuts through your lower ridge." Ben didn't speak, but his eyes sharpened. They finished their coffee in mostly quiet, the kind of silence where thinking took up all the air. As they walked out, Marge waved a refill at Ben, who declined with a tip of his cap. Back home, the sun had begun to slant through the pines. Dust floated in golden shafts through the cabin windows. Caleb paused at the threshold, watching his father walk straight to the bookshelf. Ben pulled a cracked green binder from the bottom shelf, the one marked Land, East Ridge. Inside were folded maps, black and white copies of old deed records, and a yellow envelope with a sticky note still bearing his mother's handwriting, "Ask Grace if this is still valid." He laid everything out on the dining table without a word. Caleb ran a hand along the bird logs lined up nearby, journals belonging to 3 generations of Halvorsens. A red bookmark stuck out from one, a feather pressed flat inside. Ben studied a photocopy, lips barely moving as he read. Then he pulled out one sheet, a grainy diagram marked with boundary lines and a scrawled note in his father's hand, red post equals corner of Heron Loop split. He held it up to the light. They say Caleb trespassed on HOA-controlled land, he said finally. But Heron Loop runs along our eastern boundary. Caleb straightened. So they're wrong? Ben didn't answer directly. He set the paper down, pushed the binder aside, and stood. That trail runs across our east boundary. Always has. Let's go find the deed. In a rusted tube behind the workbench, Ben unrolls a 1971 land survey marked in faded red ink, private trail access, Halvorsen family. The map crinkled as he smoothed it across the kitchen table, its edges curling like an old leaf. Caleb leaned over his shoulder, brushing aside sawdust from the workbench that clung to his sweater sleeve. The Halvorsen homestead was still quiet, save for the low groan of the potbelly stove settling into its morning heat and the occasional chirp of birds testing their spring voices outside the windows. Ben squinted at the faded lines. Here's the ridge, he murmured, tapping a section marked with pine symbols. And there, that bend? That's the trail. Heron Loop didn't even exist by name back then. We just called it the lower path. Caleb nodded slowly. But it's the same path? Exactly the same. Ben opened a second folder, yellowed at the corners, and pulled out a reissued deed from 1993. The language was precise, legal, almost cold, but the intent was clear. The eastern boundary extended through what the HOA now labeled as public access. Caleb reached across and gently lifted an old envelope tucked behind the documents. Inside were faded Polaroids, a dozen elementary school kids gathered around a bearded man in a forest green ranger's vest, Ben's father, pointing toward a hand-carved sign that read Halvorsen Trail Access. In another, a smiling woman in a knitted hat handed out illustrated bird guides. My mom? Caleb asked. Ben nodded, eyes softening for the first time that day. She used to lead spring nature walks during migration season. Your grandpa marked the trail for her. They sat in silence for a while. Then Ben stood and walked over to the laptop perched awkwardly on a shelf above the woodpile. The Wi-Fi was slow, but it did the job. He clicked open a video window, and within a moment, Grace Velasquez filled the screen from her home office. Ben, she said without looking up, flipping pages and holding a mug that read "This is my deposition face. I hope this isn't about squirrels in your crawlspace again." Better, Ben replied. It's about land. Grace paused mid-page and glanced at him over the rim of her glasses. Well, now you've got my attention. Caleb shifted into view, and Grace offered a small wave. Hey, kiddo. You still taking pictures of birds or just collecting violations? Both, Caleb said dryly. Ben held up the reissued deed to the camera. Grace adjusted her lens focus and whistled low. Clean margins. Reaffirmed in '93. That's gold. Can they find Caleb for birdwatching on this trail? Ben asked. Grace shook her head. Only if they own it. Which they don't. If they've been using it for events, signage, or foot traffic, especially with money involved, they're trespassing. And possibly liable. Caleb leaned forward. There's more. This morning, I hiked the loop. Someone's changed the sign. Ben looked over, surprised. I didn't want to make a thing out of it, but... Caleb pulled his phone from his pocket, thumbed to a photo, and held it up to the screen. There it was. A freshly mounted, polished oak sign at the trail entrance, Karen Trail, a community legacy. Grace's eyebrows rose. Subtle as ever. They renamed it after themselves, Ben muttered, jaw tight. Grace nodded. That tells me two things. 1, they're asserting control. 2, there's likely something planned. When groups rename property, it's often a precursor to permanent claims, like parks, roads, or... She flipped through a folder beside her, events. Yup. Here we go. She turned the camera toward her screen, showing an HOA newsletter, annual walkathon for conservation, now featuring the Karen Trail. 2 weeks away. Sponsors welcome. Walkathon, Grace said. Which means people, press, photos, maybe even money changing hands. On our land, Ben said flatly. There was a long pause between the three of them. You'll need proof. Dates. Images. Flyers. If they're monetizing access. Caleb stood, already walking toward the back door. I'll hike the loop again. Get better shots. Ben watched him go, then turned back to the laptop. Grace, he said, quieter now. You still have the papers from my dad's old boundary appeals? Grace didn't smile, but her voice softened. I've got everything, Ben. I've been saving it for the right fight. She signed off, promising to send documents that night. By late afternoon, Caleb had returned, boots muddied and cheeks flushed. He didn't speak, just handed Ben a thumb drive with the day's photos. Before dinner, they worked together for the first time in years, clearing the trail edge of brambles, brushing away winter limbs. Neither spoke much. The shared silence was its own kind of conversation. The sun was low by the time Ben stepped into the last bend of the loop. The trees filtered the light into gold threads, and the moss glowed underfoot. He paused as he reached the clearing. There, affixed cleanly between two cedars, stood the new HOA sign. Its glossy finish and serif font seemed jarring against the soft bark and earth. He stared at it for a long moment, hands at his sides. Behind him, Caleb's voice was quiet. What are we going to do? Ben didn't hesitate. We're going to name it back. A tan envelope marked Cease and Desist lands quietly on the HOA bulletin board between flyers for dog yoga and bake sales. It blended in, at first glance, no bold red lettering or urgent font, just plain legal print on soft cardstock. But those who looked closely saw the seal, Grace Velasquez, attorney at law. The wind caught the edge of the envelope, fluttering it against a flyer advertising sunset meditation at the Karen trailhead. Ben had walked the letter over himself that morning, envelope tucked under one arm, his other hand gripping a thermos more out of habit than need. He slid it into the HOA mailbox and pinned a second copy onto the corkboard beside the produce bins at Miller's grocery. A few shoppers passed him as he stepped back. One nodded, another glanced quickly at the board and then looked away. Later that evening, the Halvorsen living room glowed with firelight and the low flicker of the muted TV. Legal papers were spread out across the table, corners weighted by mugs and a worn tape dispenser. Caleb sat on the couch, flipping absently through a field guide. Ben paced slowly behind him, rereading the letter he and Grace had finalized the night before. The wording was precise, patient. It cited deed lines, historical access, and misappropriation of land for commercial use. Grace had phrased it all like an invitation to reconsider rather than a demand. But Ben knew better. It was a shot across the bow. She made it sound civil, Ben said, folding the letter. But it cuts close. Caleb looked up. You think they'll take it seriously? Ben didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the remote and turned the volume up a notch. The screen showed the monthly HOA meeting, broadcast on Channel 11 Public Access, where old high school football games and local zoning debates shared airtime. The camera was slightly tilted, framing a small multipurpose room lined with folding chairs. A table near the front held a tray of lemon bars that no one touched and a coffee urn labeled hot. Barely. Karen McConnell stood at the podium, her signature burgundy blazer buttoned tight, a gold HOA pin gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Carl Brewster sat beside her, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped in his lap. Karen's voice was smooth, her smile fixed. It has come to our attention, she said, that a resident has expressed concern over access to what has long been known as the Karen Trail. Let me be clear, we preserve this trail for future generations. She paused, waiting for the light applause. Ben stood behind the couch, arms crossed. Karen continued. There's been talk of deeds, of boundaries. But this trail has been open to the public for years. No objections. No conflict. Until now. She lifted the cease and desist letter from the table, holding it between two fingers like it might smudge her manicure. We see this as a misunderstanding, she said with a laugh. A difference of perspective. More claps, a few chuckles. Carl shifted slightly, eyes flicking to the floor. And let me reassure everyone here, Karen concluded, nothing will stop the walkathon. Ben's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room as he spoke to Caleb. Then we better be ready. The room on screen dissolved into small conversations and idle shuffling. The lemon bars remained untouched. Ben muted the television again, letting the silence settle like dust. Caleb leaned forward and shut the laptop with a gentle click. At the edge of the coffee table, Ben's phone buzzed. He picked it up slowly, brows knitting as he read the subject line of a new email. You should see what's in this proposal. There was no sender name. Just an attachment, a PDF blueprint. He tapped it open, and the title glared back. Phase 1, Glamping Cabins. The blueprint was glossy, labeled Aspen Ridge Eco Retreat, with dotted lines tracing cabins and fire pits, right across Ben's woods. Rain tapped gently on the tin roof like distant typewriter keys as Ben sat at the kitchen table, the blueprint spread open under the yellow light. His reading glasses rested halfway down his nose, unmoving, as he stared at the layout like it might blink first. The scent of damp earth and pine crept in through the cracked kitchen window. The cabins were laid out in neat pairs, circling a proposed bathhouse near the bend of the Heron Loop Trail. A note in the lower corner read Paid Access Entry Gate, HOA members only. Caleb stood at the other end of the table, arms crossed, his jaw tight. They're calling it a retreat, he said. It's a campground with Wi-Fi. Ben didn't speak. His eyes moved slowly across the page until they landed on the bottom right signature box. There, beneath the title Consultant, was a name in smooth cursive, Karen McConnell. Caleb leaned in, pointing. She's not just approving this. She's part of it. Ben gave a low, quiet exhale. In the background, the potbelly stove crackled softly. The warmth inside the cabin contrasted too sharply with what lay on the table, 8 rental tents, utility paths, and a bathhouse that would sit atop what once was his father's deer watching spot. Ben stood and walked to the wall where the 1970s land map still hung, yellowed and brittle behind glass. It showed the same woods, labeled by hand in thick pencil, Eastern Slope, private use only. His father had underlined it twice. I should have taken that sign down when the lettering started to fade, Ben muttered. But I didn't think they'd try to pave over a memory. The laptop chimed. Caleb walked over and clicked open the inbox. A new email sat at the top, subject line, I thought the HOA was about preserving nature, not selling it. The sender was just initials, LT. Inside, a short message. I work the front desk. I've seen the budget drafts, the sponsor lists, even a version of the HOA newsletter they never published. They've pitched this eco-retreat to 3 investor groups. I stayed quiet too long. This land deserves better. Lila. Caleb looked up. Lila Thomas. She's Karen's assistant. Ben's gaze hardened, but his voice remained low. So someone inside wants out. He picked up the blueprint again, studying the details anew, not with confusion now, but with focus. She says they've pitched this to investors, he said. Caleb nodded. And they're pretending it's HOA-owned land. Ben turned back toward the laptop and opened a video call. Grace's face flickered to life a few seconds later, backlit by the soft glow of her desk lamp and framed by stacks of folders, legal books, and a lush fern curling toward the ceiling. Ben, she said, tugging her glasses down. Tell me what I'm looking at. Ben held up the blueprint. 8 tents. 1 bathhouse. Fire pits. A trail gate. She leaned closer. Let me guess, on your land? Caleb turned the paper to show the consultants section. Grace narrowed her eyes. Well, that settles it, she said. They're not just trespassing. They're planning to profit. Ben didn't speak, but Grace knew that expression, years of restraint pressed into the lines around his eyes. I'll prep a package, she continued. You'll want someone local, small town enough to care but loud enough to stir dust. Lisa Renner, Ben said. Grace smiled. Already thought of her. She owes me a favor from a wetlands case back in 18. I'll send her what we have. Caleb moved to the map again, then slowly walked to the window. Rain streaked down the glass. He turned back to Ben. I know I haven't said this much, he started, his voice tight. But this matters. To me, too. Ben looked up. His expression softened, not a full smile, but close. Caleb cleared his throat and finished quietly, I'm with you, Dad. The word hung in the room, as steady and unexpected as a cardinal in winter. Ben gave a slow nod, then returned to the blueprint. His fingers moved across the page until they reached a shaded section labeled Phase 2. In small, italicized print. Pavilion and parking expansion, requires tree removal. He stared at the screen. Rain tapped harder now. Outside, the forest was still. The Karen Trail banner fluttered above the entrance, with folding tables lining the lawn and smell of cinnamon popcorn in the air. Children ran between booth legs with paper flags in hand, while a boom box near the cider stand cycled through soft folk songs from a playlist labeled Family Forward. The HOA lawn buzzed with last-minute preparations, folding chairs being unfolded, extension cords uncoiled, and name tags arranged in neat alphabetical stacks. Karen McConnell stood beneath the banner, clipboard in hand, her tailored vest bearing the HOA crest, stitched, not ironed, as she liked to remind people. Her hair was pinned high, and her voice carried easily over the murmur of volunteers. Thank you all for being here, she said, smile affixed like a monogram. This trail, this event, this community, we are its caretakers. Its stewards. Applause followed. Carl Brewster, standing a few paces behind, clapped slowly, hesitated when someone nudged him to introduce her. Instead, he stepped aside without speaking. Across the trail, Ben watched from his porch with a steaming cup of black coffee in hand. The wind carried bits of the speech but not enough to matter. Caleb stood beside him, arms folded, gaze fixed not on Karen but on the crowd that cheered her. It's a good turnout, Caleb muttered. Ben sipped, then said quietly, so was every sale pitch in history. At the Hollow Mug Cafe, Grace sat across from Lisa Renner in a booth near the window. Lisa had her recorder out but kept it resting on a napkin, not yet activated. She was in her early 40s, glasses perched low, with the tired curiosity of someone who'd seen too many bake sales passed off as civic news. Grace slid over a folder. Inside, the deed copy, the blueprint with Karen's signature, the cease and desist letter, and annotated HOA bylaws with yellow post-its like flags in a battlefield. Lisa flipped through the pages in silence. Her eyes paused at the trail boundary notes, then again at the phrase, Phase 2, tree removal. And the walkathon happens tomorrow? She asked. Grace nodded. On the Halvorsens' land. Lisa glanced out the window toward the lawn. If this goes to print, it won't just be a headline. It'll be an audit trail. That's the idea, Grace said. Can you publish by morning? Lisa's expression didn't change, but she reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive. I brought my layout files just in case. Back at the trail's edge, the last of the tents were being secured with sandbags. Mabel Carter arranged small potted succulents on her donation table. Walt stood near the grill booth, sniffing the air like a man testing for truth in the smell of funnel cake. Somewhere, a teenager tuned a guitar, plucking uneven chords of Take Me Home, Country Roads. Karen circulated, shaking hands, posing for photos. Lila stood near the refreshments, quiet, unreadable. Caleb crossed his arms tighter. Ben didn't move from his spot. He just watched the symmetry of it all, the deliberate chaos made to look organic, the false hum of community pride packaged in branded aprons and HOA lanyards. Dusk came soft and early. The lights strung along the tents flickered on, giving the lawn a cozy glow. Lisa returned to the cabin just after nightfall. "It's going up," she said, handing Grace a slip of paper. 6 a.m. online. Print trucks roll at 8. Ben nodded once, then retreated to the porch again. Grace stood beside him a moment, silent. Then she asked, "You sure you're ready?" "I've been ready since they renamed the trail," he said. "Now it's just watching the storm arrive." Later that night, Caleb stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The woods were still, save for the patter of wind against needles. As he scanned the trail entrance, his beam caught movement, just the tail end of it. Someone was bent low, pulling something from the ground. A wooden stake. The boundary marker. By the time Caleb reached the spot, the figure was gone. Only fresh disturbance in the soil and the dragged impression of the stake remained. He returned to the cabin, mud on his boots. Ben met him at the door, saw the empty spot in Caleb's hand, and didn't ask a question. "It's starting," Ben said. At 9 a.m., the trail buzzed with chatter and camera clicks, until a white forestry division truck rumbled into view. The balloon arch at the entrance swayed gently in the morning breeze, colors bouncing against the bright sun. Sponsor banners lined the railings, listing local bakeries, banks, and an insurance firm with an ironic tagline, "We protect what matters." Folding tables were draped in checkered cloths, and paper cups of cider steamed beside rows of commemorative buttons labeled Karen Trail Walkathon 2023. Karen stood near the head of the trail, flanked by Carl and a laminated program. Her vest gleamed in the sun, HOA crest shining just above the stitched phrase "Lead with Purpose." Her tone was crisp, rehearsed. "This trail," she said, raising a hand toward the woods, "is not just a path. It's a symbol. Of vision, continuity, and pride. Of community." Scattered applause. Lisa stood off to the side, mic in hand, its blue phone cover reading Hollow Herald. Her recorder blinked red. She scanned the crowd while keeping one ear tuned. Across the lot, Grace tapped her phone. A live stream blinked live. Ben stood beside her, unreadable. Just as Karen turned to invite Carl forward, the rumble of tires cut through the applause. Heads turned. The white pickup bore the Forestry Division seal, pine tree silhouette and gold lettering, and came to a slow stop on the gravel. The driver's door opened, and a man in khaki uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. A hush rolled across the crowd like a ripple in still water. "Karen McConnell?" the officer asked, stepping toward the front. "Carl Brewster?" Karen blinked. "Yes, I'm the president of..." The officer held out the clipboard. "You've been served with an injunction. Filed this morning, per county authorization." Carl's face paled. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. "This trail," the officer continued, "is under dispute regarding rightful ownership. As of this morning, all organized activity, including commercial or sponsored use, must cease pending review." Murmurs spread like fire through dry grass. Karen forced a smile. "There must be some mistake. This is a misunderstanding." Grace stepped forward, voice calm, clear. "There's no mistake," she said. "We've provided deed documentation, boundary surveys, and evidence of unpermitted commercial activity on land owned by the Halvorsen family." Lisa's camera swung toward her, mic up. Karen turned, voice tightening. "This is a personal vendetta. A smear campaign. Ben Halvorsen has been out of touch with this community for years." Ben didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He only spoke once, steady as a steel cable. "No," he said. "This is personal responsibility." There was a pause. Then a shifting, low murmur from the gathered crowd. Lisa moved through the bystanders, quietly asking questions. "I thought this was public land," one woman said. "Didn't they rename it last year?" another asked. Mabel stood near the cider table, arms folded. Carl stepped back. His eyes avoided Karen's. A gust of wind pulled one of the banners loose. It flapped noisily, the words "nature belongs to everyone" twisting in the air like they didn't know where to land. The forestry officer walked the injunction back to his truck, leaving silence in his wake. Karen faced the crowd, trying to salvage the moment. "We are stewards," she said, her voice cracking. "We've preserved this land. We've..." A voice rose from the back. A teenager in a navy hoodie stood near the water cooler, phone in hand, live streaming. "You find someone for watching birds," he called out. "Is that what you call stewardship?" Karen's smile faltered. Just for a second. But it was long enough. The town hall echoed with the scrape of folding chairs and shuffling feet, but Karen's voice sliced through the quiet like a blade. "This is a smear campaign." She stood at the front of the Aspen Ridge Community Center beneath flickering fluorescent lights that hummed just above hearing. The space smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, with framed photos of decades-old parades lining the walls, faces frozen in cheer from simpler years. Outside, clouds pressed low, darkening the edges of the windows. Karen gripped the lectern. Her HOA pin gleamed, but her blouse was slightly wrinkled at the collar, an unfamiliar detail that didn't go unnoticed. "This meeting," she said, "was supposed to be about reflection and planning. But it's been hijacked. Twisted into an attack on character and years of service." Chairs creaked as neighbors shifted in their seats. Walt Merritt sat in the second row, arms folded across his chest. Mabel clutched a small red notebook in her lap. In the back, Caleb leaned against the wall beside Ben, whose arms remained crossed, expression unreadable. Grace Velasquez stepped forward. She didn't take the lectern, just a calm step to the center, holding a folder with neat corners and quiet weight. "We are not here to insult character," she began. "We are here because facts require consequence." She opened the folder, removed a clipped packet, and handed it to Carl Brewster at the board table. "This is documentation of land deed ownership confirming the Halvorsen family's legal claim to the Heron Loop Trail, what's been called the Karen Trail." She placed a second document beside it. "This is a development proposal filed for potential investor review, signed by Ms. McConnell as consultant, outlining commercial plans including rental units, bathhouse facilities, and a paid access system." Gasps and murmurs stirred. Karen's eyes flashed. Carl glanced down at the forms. His fingers twitched. "I didn't read all of this when I initialed," he said, voice low. "I thought it was a landscaping budget." Grace turned to him. "You initialed a map that proposed tree removal on private land." A voice near the center of the room, "You didn't notice?" Carl didn't answer. Lila stood from her seat along the side wall. She held up a stapled packet. "This is a planning draft I was asked to type up last fall," she said. Page 3 lists the trail system as a revenue opportunity via brandiable wilderness. That's a direct quote. Eyes turned to Karen. She straightened. Drafts don't mean anything. None of this was official. But the air had shifted. Mabel stood slowly. Her voice was quiet, but the room fell still to hear her. "My husband Frank took notes on every HOA meeting he ever attended," she said. "He kept them in this book." She flipped it open, found a marked page, and read, "Beware those who speak of order but mean control." The silence grew thicker, broken only by the tick of the old wall clock near the back door. Karen's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her folder. She glanced at Carl, but he looked away. A woman in the front row stood up, Mrs. Rourke, always the first to donate pies to town bake sales and never one for drama. "I vote to remove Ms. McConnell from this board," she said simply. Someone else stood. Second. Then another. And another. A rustle of movement. Some hands raised. Others nodded. Carl cleared his throat, standing slowly. "We will now call a motion for removal of board member Karen McConnell based on violation of bylaws, misrepresentation of property boundaries, and failure to disclose development conflicts." He looked down at the count. Then back up. Motion passed. Karen remained frozen for a moment. Her mouth opened, as if to protest, but no words came. She closed it again, lifted her folder, and walked out through the side door. No one followed. Grace didn't speak. She just gathered her papers, neat as ever, and tucked them under one arm. Her expression held no triumph. Only a quiet finality. The clock ticked. A chair creaked. Then someone let out a long, steady breath, like the air had shifted and finally, the room could breathe. A new wooden sign stood beneath the arching pines, Herrenloop, open with respect. Its letters hand-carved, sealed in linseed oil. The morning air was cool but carried the scent of warm cider and pine needles. Sunlight filtered through the trees in long, golden stripes, brushing the mossy earth and the folding chairs lined up for the early arrivals. Walt had already claimed one of the sturdier ones, a cup of cider in one hand, his cane resting against the leg. Ben stood by the sign, one palm resting on its smooth cedar surface. Caleb stood beside him, a quiet presence, fingers tucked around the strap of his camera bag. Around them, the community had gathered, not in protest or tension, but in something gentler. Renewal. Grace stepped forward with a small clipboard in hand. Her blazer was rolled to the elbows, and a green ribbon pinned to her lapel fluttered in the breeze. "We'd like to formally announce," she said, "that the Aspen Ridge Land Trust is now active. It's donation-based, community-run, and here to protect this trail, and others like it, so they remain open with care, not just intention." Applause rippled softly. Mabel wiped her eyes behind her glasses. Children darted between trees, laughing, chasing each other with laminated bird guides in hand. Lila crouched beside a small group, pointing out the forked tail of a barn swallow dipping toward the clearing. "See that?" she said. "They come back every year. Even after all the noise." Walt chuckled. "My grandson fell in that creek once chasing one of those. Got soaked, lost his boot. Kept the photo, though." He turned to the boy next to him, his grandson's own son now, who blinked up at him in wonder. Lisa snapped photos near the signpost. She looked through her viewfinder, paused, and lowered the camera. "This," she said softly, "is the real headline." Ben didn't move, but he smiled faintly. Caleb caught the moment, raising his own camera and clicking once. The cider table was surrounded now, cookies disappearing fast. Someone tuned a fiddle in the distance, the soft notes of simple gifts weaving gently between the trees. Ben stepped forward and ran his fingers along the base of the sign, where the wood met the earth. His fingertips brushed something, paper. Tucked carefully between the post and the packed soil was a folded note. Plain, small. He opened it slowly. No name. Just 4 handwritten lines. "You were right. I forgot what this trail meant. I hope it's not too late to remember. I'm sorry." No signature, but the paper smelled faintly of lavender. Ben closed it gently, slipping it into his pocket without a word. Caleb approached, raising his binoculars as a bird call rang from the ridge. "Bald eagle," he said, eyes shining. "Over the ridge." Ben lifted his gaze skyward, spotting the wide wingspan as it soared above the treetops, a steady arc against the blue. He nodded once, firm. "Tell the others." Caleb grinned and turned, already calling to the kids, pointing up. Ben lingered by the sign. Then, without ceremony, he reached into his coat and pulled out an old leather field journal. The corners were softened with age, the spine mended with tape. He handed it to Caleb. "Add your own pages," he said. Behind them, children held brushes, carefully repainting the old boundary posts in forest green. The color matched the trees. Matched the trust. Matched the name they'd claimed back. On a quiet spring morning, the Herrenloop stood open once again, no fences, no banners, just laughter among trees and a sign that asked only for respect. The trail, like the town, had come full circle, misused, reclaimed, and made whole not by noise, but by truth and quiet persistence. When power is misused, even simple joys like birdwatching can become battles, But when communities stand together, justice finds its voice. Like a trail carved through years of overgrowth, courage clears the way for others to follow. Perhaps it's never too late to pick up a worn field journal, lift your eyes to the ridge, and begin again.